Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Eileen Doherty-Sil. I'm the Department of Political Science Associate Director of the Undergraduate Program, which is actually just a fancy way of saying I'm the Poli-Sci Major Advisor. So if any of you are interested in political science classes or learning more about political science here at Penn, please let me know either by email or come talk to me. The Knowledge by the Slice series is sponsored by Penn Arts and Sciences to give the campus community a chance to hear from some of the school's outstanding faculty members. So before I introduce our panel, let me start by thanking the School of Arts and Sciences, specifically Lindsay Klinger O'Donnell, Danielle Matto, the AV team who are here, and everyone else in the School of Arts and Sciences who makes this possible. They really are amazing. Today we've got a group of political science faculty to talk about election 2016, what just happened. Next to me is Professor Matt Levendusky, who is in the Annenberg School of Communication. His research focuses on the political behavior of ordinary citizens. He does this through studies of mass polarization, voter cue taking, the impact of partisan media on ordinary voters, and other questions. Next to him is Professor Daniel Hopkins, who studies American politics, local political behavior, and research methods. He also has a secondary appointment at the Annenberg School of Communication and is an occasional blogger at 538. Next to him is Professor Marc Meredith, who is the undergraduate chair of the Political Science Department. Professor Meredith holds a secondary appointment at the Wharton School. His research examines the political campaigns and voter decision-making. And next to him is Dr. Brielle Harbin, who is a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Political Science. Her interests include political behavior, partisanship, moral psychology, public opinion, and political psychology. She's exploring the effect of political storytelling on political attention, government blame attribution, and political beliefs and behavior more broadly. I should also note that in our department is Professor John Lipinski, who runs the decision desk at NBC. And he was there obviously running that desk on election night, and Professors Levendusky and Meredith were there with him assisting in the effort. So they have firsthand experience in what happened. Following the presentation, we should have plenty of time for your questions. We're going to talk for about 7 minutes each max. We're also running a live webinar of today's talk, so we may also be taking a few questions from our remote audience. So please enjoy the discussion. We're going to go in reverse order of announcement, starting with Dr. Harbin.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? I get a little closer. Okay, so hello everyone. I want to add two main points about the role of race in this election to the conversation. I'm going to keep my comments relatively brief because I want us to be able to have enough time to discuss. So point number one is that prior to Tuesday, there was a dominant narrative in the liberal-leaning media that Trump voters were, for the most part, non-college educated white voters. Yet the exit poll data that we've seen that were released yesterday suggests that this is not really an exhaustive account of white support for Trump voters. And so I have a couple of visualizations here to take us through. So all of these slides that I'm going to show you are white support for Trump. So here we see just aggregate white vote, 58% Trump, 37% Clinton. Looking now by age cohorts, 48% of 18 to 29-year-olds. Now 30 to 44, 55% Trump vote support. Now looking at 45 to 64, 63%, 58% of those 65 and older. And then what's really interesting to me in this election has been thinking about gender and together. So looking at this, 62% of non-college educated white women went for Trump. And then you see here, which is really interesting, 45% of college educated white women. And then finally, 81% of white evangelical voters went for Trump. So I think these data are important to grapple with collectively because they suggest that we need to kind of question and revise the narrative that talked about the role of white voters in this election. For many, it's surprising and in many ways uncomfortable, the takeaway that Trump voters included both college-educated and non-college-educated white people across all age groups. Like that's, I mean, we still need to see the final data, but this is what the preliminary data are suggesting. So for the last 48 hours, I've really been asking myself, like, why is that? What's happening here? So I think that there are a couple of different potential explanations. So is it that there's a backlash to African American advances, a referendum on establishment politics, a lack of trust in Hillary Clinton, misogyny, a referendum on political correctness, anxieties surrounding job losses? I think political scientists at different points over the course of this election have argued these different points, and I think my personal opinion is that it's kind of like a perfect storm of all of these things together. And there's actually a piece that came out on Monkey Cage by Larry Bartels, a political scientist at Vanderbilt, that actually makes an argument that it really was just several small shifts that contributed to like a big change, like a big change difference this time around. So nevertheless, I think a key takeaway point in this election is that one about honesty in talking about how we're going to vote. So there were clearly people who voted for Trump who weren't forthcoming in the polls, and so I think there are critiques here for political scientists who do survey research. And so that's a conversation that we're probably going to be having it as a discipline, but that was something I think that contributed to some of the surprise that people have felt in the last couple of days. So the second point that I want to put on the table is about the need for context in media accounts of voter turnout, particularly with respect to Black voters and their impact on this election. So most of you have likely seen headlines like this: Clinton made her case to Black voters, why didn't they hear her? Hillary Clinton failed to win over Black, Hispanic, and female voters. The charts that show why she lost the presidential election are weak early voter turnout among African Americans hurts Clinton in Florida. So I want to just point out that it's crucial that we place these claims about voter turnout in a broader social and political context. So when you consider the different approaches that states have taken in restricting early voting, purging voter rolls, the number of voting locations, felon voting laws, voter ID laws, and the disproportionate effect that these decisions have on voters of color, especially African American voters. Narratives, I think, that focus on group level behavior without placing this behavior in the proper social and political context and reflect these structural causes are somewhat disingenuous. So particularly when the exit poll data show that Black voters who did show up overwhelmingly supported Clinton, particularly Black women. So more specifically, 94% of Black women supported Hillary Clinton compared to 96% of Black women who supported Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012. 80% of Black men supported Hillary Clinton compared to 87% of Black men who supported Obama in 2012. So while there was a decline in Black support for the Democratic candidate, the level of support to me seems still to be like relatively high. So for me, I've just really been wondering, like, what were people expecting, especially when I don't know if people in the room have seen the 13th documentary, where I think it's really becoming part of the broader narrative, like public narrative, not just among intellectuals, about mass incarceration and thinking about the historical argument for that and the role specifically that the Clintons played in that. So still to me, I think that the most important racial story from this election is that of white voter behavior and thinking about what is happening in these various subgroups and thinking about what that can tell us about elections going forward.
So I'm going to pick up on a couple of themes that Brielle already talked about. Before I do that, though, I need to get a little egg off my face. I see a few of you here who took Intro to American Politics with me last fall, where on my last lecture I very confidently said that there was no way that Donald Trump was going to win the Republican nomination, that you could go home and tell your families over the holidays that you had it on good authority, and that he had no backing of the party, and that would ultimately be his downfall. So clearly, you have to take what I say now with a certain grain of salt, given the historical context that is put in. I want to pick up on the theme of turnout, because I think one facet of American elections that has been lost is how many votes don't get counted on election day, and how much voting we have shifted towards provisional ballots and other ballots of that sort. We don't know what turnout is in this election yet. We actually don't know what the popular vote margin is going to be yet, in part because there are so many ballots that haven't been counted yet. Those ballots are not randomly distributed within the population. If I had to guess, currently Clinton is a little bit ahead in the popular vote. I think she's going to end up substantially ahead in the popular vote. I'm not convinced that turnout was actually down in this election. I think that remains to be seen. And I'm not convinced African-American turnout was down in this election. That remains to be seen. So we want to be a little bit careful on jumping to conclusions right away based on what we know in current vote counts. I'm going to focus specifically on Pennsylvania. It was one of the states I was thinking about a lot on election night on the decision desk, and pick up on this theme of turnout, which was, to the best of our knowledge, the reason Clinton lost Pennsylvania was not the Philadelphia area. It was not declining turnout in Philadelphia. If we looked at Philadelphia plus the surrounding counties, Clinton actually netted more votes in these counties than Obama did in 2012 when he won the state. So the Philadelphia area was more supportive as a whole and netted more votes once we add them all up, even based on what we know now, than Obama did. Pittsburgh was also, Allegheny County was also slightly more pro-Clinton than they were Obama in terms of total votes. So what that leaves is a residual. What was not in Allegheny County and the Philadelphia area, which shifted dramatically. I think this is going to be the big narrative coming out of this campaign, was what happened in rural America, where we think we see right now about a 10-point shift away from Obama's performance in 2012 when we look at Clinton's performance. Why is it that we see Clinton so underperforming, or we see Clinton so underperforming Obama in these counties? Kathy Kramer-Walsh is a political scientist at the University of Wisconsin. I really like her work. She's a qualitative political scientist who's been going around Wisconsin for a long time, interviewing rural people from Wisconsin about what they think about politics and how politics has shifted in their minds. One common theme she picks up in rural Wisconsin, which I'm guessing also applies in rural Pennsylvania, is a sense that politics doesn't work for people like us, that we are not respected by politics, and we don't respect the politics as the political context as a result. And I think there's a lot to be said that Obama may have been able to overcome that in some ways with his rhetoric, with his language, with the way people just think about Obama as a candidate that might be unique relative to any other Democratic candidate out there. Polls weren't that far off, it turns out, in the aggregate. I think the polling average suggested Clinton would win the popular vote by 3%. I think she's going to come pretty close to that. What they missed was the distribution of support. They missed where that support was going to come from, and it's why the polls were seemingly way off in places like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, where it seems that the rural vote didn't show up. And I think a lot of the things that Brielle talked about in her list of potential explanations are explanations for why we see this rural vote shift. But I think moving forward, if the Democrats want to recapture the presidency and not be in minorities in both the Senate and the House, they're going to have to think about how to win these voters back. One strand of political science research that suggests a potential path comes from Nick Carnes and other co-authors. Nick Carnes is a political scientist at Duke who's focused on the decline of working class candidates. The Democratic Party used to run more working class candidates, largely recruited through labor unions. That seemingly has evaporated. And as a result, you have a lot of working class people who, when faced with a choice between Democratic and Republican candidates are not seeing people like them on the ballot. And so I think one path forward the Democratic Party is going to need to think about is how can they get more working class candidates on the ballot to potentially assuage some of the fears of rural Pennsylvania and rural America more broadly, that the types of people who they would be supporting if they were supporting Democratic candidates are not descriptively like them. And so I'll leave it there, and I hope to hear more from all of you in Q&A.
So I'm Dan Hopkins. This is my second year at Penn, and I should just do a brief bit of advertising. This spring I'm actually teaching a class called The Changing American Electorate. So if this hour-long conversation leaves you unsatisfied or with questions, and you're a student here, I very, very much welcome you to take that class in the spring. A couple years ago, 4 years ago I think, I wrote a piece about prediction models. And I termed forecasting models or prediction models the Pro Bowl of political science. So for people who know football, the Pro Bowl happens after the Super Bowl, and it's kind of an all-star game, but players don't want to get hurt. They don't take it very seriously. And I think that's a good metaphor for how the discipline of political science treats election forecasting. That is to say, there are a small number of political scientists who do election forecasting, but it's not central to our discipline. It's not that we're all going to go, the four of us are going to go back to our offices and tweak models of the 40-some-odd most recent presidential elections for the next 4 years. So when people come to us and say, or come to political scientists and say, hey, your discipline was horribly off in this election, I think that critique is somewhat overstated in the sense that, yes, a number of the tools that we apply can be used to help make sense of elections, but none of us spends our days predicting whether Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton is going to get 51 or 49% of the two-party vote in a given state. That said, in retrospect, I don't think it is particularly surprising that this election hinged on states like Pennsylvania, states like Michigan, states like Wisconsin. If you look back to the 2012 election and you array all the states based on the share of the vote that Barack Obama got, and then you calculate how many electoral college votes each state gets, what you learn is that Pennsylvania was the tipping point state in the last election. Pennsylvania was the state in which the 270th electoral college vote was cast in 2012. And that may well be true in this election as well, at which point Professor Meredith owes me a beer. But I think more importantly, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, these are all states that in 2010 elected Republican governors in elections that weren't that close. 2 of the 3 elected Republican governors in 2014. All 3 have Republican legislatures. So the idea that these states could be competitive in a presidential election should not shock us ex ante. Should have shocked us ex ante and certainly shouldn't shock us today. All of these are states that have a relatively large number of white voters without college degrees. And with explaining any election, you're going to have as many explanations as you have voters in that election. I think one of the things that is incumbent upon us, especially just after an election, is not to just grab for that first piece of data and settle on a single narrative that makes sense of how many millions of people voted. Many millions of people voted for different reasons. And I think one of the key questions is, what was the role of race and racism in motivating vote choice? One of the challenges is that any one explanation is going to be incomplete. It's only going to get at a small number of people. That said, I think it's instructive to compare a state like Pennsylvania and a state like Virginia. So Virginia is a state that had traditionally been a Republican-leaning state, but where there are a lot of college-educated voters who are pretty entrenched in their party views, may follow politics a little more closely, and a lot of African-American voters who are, as Dr. Harbin had just been saying, very overwhelmingly Democratic voters. So Virginia, in the last several years, has seen a whole set of elections that have not varied by more than 3 or 4%, right? So Mark Warner won the Virginia Senate seat in 2014 by, 1%? And Terry McAuliffe won the governor's chair in 2013 by 2%. And Barack Obama won in 2012 by 3%, right? Virginia's a very, very stable state. But states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, states where there are a lot of white working class voters, they're more elastic states. They're states where we've seen a wide range of outcomes, from Democrats being elected pretty handily to Republicans being elected pretty handily. I think another thing that's worth noting, does anybody know who received the most votes here in Pennsylvania, best we can tell, in this 2016 election? Anybody know? So everybody's silent, meaning that people suspect there's a trick, and there is. It was Josh Shapiro, the Democrat running for Attorney General. Josh Shapiro received more votes than did Donald Trump. Josh Shapiro received more votes than did Hillary Clinton. And that suggests that at least part of the story of this election is people going into the ballot, so people voting, but choosing not to back one of the two major party candidates. And that fits with something more generally that we know in political science. So there is an understandable emphasis on turnout, shifts in turnout, right? With an electorate that's so evenly divided, small shifts in turnout among key constituencies can indeed explain election outcomes, right? And it's going to look like in this election, if you reallocated 100,000 votes, you would have made Hillary Clinton president in a couple states.
It's 106.
106 currently, and
and it'll shift. But I think in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that's all you need to realize.
Exactly. So
sorry, you stole one of my points, but it was a good one.
So I think one of the key points to keep in mind is that while we fixate on turnout in explaining these election outcomes, when a voter chooses to turn out for a candidate or not, that voter can add one vote to that candidate's column or not. But if a voter who habitually votes decides, you know what, in this election, I'm going to switch parties, that voter not only adds one vote to the side that she or he has switched into, but takes one vote away from the side that he or she has switched from. Looking at this election, one of the things that you note is that if you look at maps of elections, the Democrats pile up votes, often winning 80, 90% of the vote in major metropolitan area, in cities specifically. But an area that we have not paid a lot of attention to as political scientists and pundits is the fact that Democrats in northern states traditionally would get 20, 30% of the vote in a lot of rural counties. And to Nate Cohen's credit at the New York Times, one of the drums he's been beating in the coverage of this election is, you know what, there are actually a sizable number of Democratic votes that come outside of cities from white voters who don't have college degrees. And it looks like that share of votes that the Democrats have counted on from rural areas and maybe taken for granted to an important extent, leading to some of what Professor Meredith talked about, that floor fell out of the Democrats to some important extent. So what you see then is rural counties that used to be maybe 70-30 counties, suddenly they're 80-20 counties. And in a tight race, in a very, very polarized electorate, that can be the difference.
Thanks. So since I'm the most senior person here, I used my privilege to go last. So I want to talk about just a couple of quick points. And the first one, for those of you who know me, won't be a big shock, and that's that partisan divisions turn out to be really, really hard to overcome. So if you look at Hillary Clinton's campaign strategy this year, and ex ante, I thought this was a great strategy. In full disclosure, I know a couple people on her team. I was like, yes, this is like such a smart strategy. So her drumbeat, right, has been throughout the general election campaign is basically that Donald Trump is not qualified to be president, right? And she has, if you remember back to the Democratic convention this summer, in many ways it was like watching a Republican convention from say like 2000 or 96, right? So we bring out all these sort of retired generals, they basically say Hillary Clinton's, basically they were promoting her hawkishness on national security, that she's going to be tough, that she's got all this experience in the international arena. We bring out the Cohen family, who gives probably the political speech of 2016, right? We do all these things, and she's effectively running, right? There wasn't a lot of what you traditionally hear of at a Democratic convention, which is sort of this kind of broad intergroup liberalism. Her strategy was effectively to say, I'm competent, I'm sane, I'm the one whose finger you want on, the nuclear trigger, right? That strategy, in a word, failed. So as of about 6 weeks ago, I thought it was winning and winning well, right? Donald Trump was only polling in the high 70s among Republicans. That sounds like a lot, but that's really, really, really bad. No Republican candidate going back to the 1970s has gotten less than, I think it's 88% of the Republican vote in the electorate. What happened, and this should have made me I should have paid more attention to this, right, as someone who spent his entire life thinking about Party D, I should have paid more attention to this, but I didn't. If you look at what happened over the last 6 weeks, basically the only shift in preferences that happened was that Republican voters came home to Trump. And that should have clued me in that something important was happening, but I and many other people completely missed that. So that's my mea culpa for today. Right, so if you want to know why college-educated whites who were supposed to deliver this election to Hillary Clinton, why they ended up, it is true they moved towards Clinton relative to Obama, but still didn't give her the margin she needed. It's that most of those people are Republicans, and at the end of the day, they decided that they disliked Trump, but they disliked Clinton more, right? And you actually see some evidence of this in the exit poll. So the exit poll weighting is still preliminary. As you might have guessed from that sentence, it was pretty off at the beginning. They almost always are. So there'll be some more reweighting that gets done later on. But basically, if you look at, there were two questions on the exit poll that I think in a way are sort of telling. One is, do you think Donald Trump has the temperament and qualifications to be president, right? A majority of people say no, and of those people, a quarter of them still voted for him. If you look, is Donald Trump honest and trustworthy, or is he a liar? 20% of people who say no, he's not at all honest and trustworthy, still voted for him, right? And we need more data to dig into this, but I suspect that when you look at those people, those are Republicans who say, yeah, I don't like Donald Trump at all, but you know what? I hate Hillary Clinton a lot more. And that's emblematic of something political scientists call affective polarization, that even though people aren't necessarily that divided in their views on the issues, right, they have deep antipathy for the other side. And I think this election is sort of, if I were going to summarize it in one word, like, that would be it. So a lot of people hit on a lot of the other stuff about how 2016 compares to 2012 and others. I want to make two other kind of quick points. One point that Nate Silver took a lot of heat for before the election, but turns out he was right on, picking up on something Professor Meredith said, is that polling errors can be correlated across states, right? So it's the same underlying problem that led the polls to be off in Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, where Trump is going to sort of outperform his polling average by about probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 points. And I think that part of what we were missing was the shift of Republican voters back. I think there was some shy Trump support, but I think it's also partly that we missed this kind of Party ID for some technical reasons. I bet it's worth thinking about that if one state poll is wrong, it's likely that that same error is going to drive other state polls to be wrong. And the last point that's sort of interesting is that this is the 5th time in American history. So there are 3 times in the 19th century, 1824, 1876, 1888, fun political trivia, right, where the Electoral College winner is not the popular vote winner, right? The one everyone always remembers is 1876, that's corrupt Hayes-Tilden election. And then there's 2000 and now 2016, where the popular vote winner is going to have lost the Electoral College. Right now, Hillary Clinton is up by about 250,000 votes. I'm going to guess that turns into something more like over 1 million votes, maybe even 2 million votes, depending on how many votes are out there in California and Washington. Keep in mind that California doesn't count a quarter of its votes on election night. So there's actually quite a big swing that will come for Hillary Clinton in the next couple of days. And the same thing happens in every election. We just don't normally pay attention to this because the results are clear and we sort of know what happened. So this brings up this disjunction then, right? So this sort of system, the way in which we elect presidential presidents through this electoral college mechanism doesn't necessarily reflect the overall national sentiment. It reflects the national sentiment as weighted by the states and their share of population. So the fact that someone like Clinton, right, basically shrinks the Republican margin in a state like Georgia and Arizona and blows out the water along the West Coast, that's really where her margin is going to come from. It's that she's going to significantly outperform Obama in the 3 states that border the Pacific. Is that still a good system? Certainly with Republicans in unified control, like that proposal is going nowhere, but it's an interesting conversation to have.
Lindsay, you were going to get microphones?
I'm struck by the fact that none of you talk about the fact that this is the first time we have a woman running for president, and I wanted to know if you could talk about the role of sexism on the part of both men and women.
So let me just, for the people who are listening, the question was about the fact that Hillary Clinton is a woman, and we haven't talked about sexism and the role of sexism in the election yet.
That's a great question. With colleagues here at Penn, I've been doing a survey since 2008. So we've interviewed the same people now 10 times, asking them their views about political figures and vote choice. Back in 2008, we asked them, tell us, do you like or dislike Hillary Clinton? Do you like or dislike Barack Obama? And we asked them that question again in 2016. Hillary Clinton's unfavorables, as is well known, have long been quite high. They have been higher than even that of Bill Clinton, dating back to Bill Clinton's administration. And so there's definitely a question about why are her unfavorables as high as they are? That said, in 2008, when she and Barack Obama were running against one another, Americans asked to rate, Obama gave him a 50 on a scale of 1 to 100. They gave Hillary Clinton a 48, so not that far behind him. And fascinatingly, and this is the key point, if you want to predict who's going to vote for Donald Trump in 2016, you would rather know what people thought of Barack Obama in 2008 than Hillary Clinton in 2008. How could that be? I think the reason is because Hillary Clinton in 2016 is the face of the Democratic Party, right? And she is a very particular candidate in that she has been associated with the Iraq War, with the financial crisis, with a whole set of, Dr. Harbin made reference to criminal justice policies in the 1990s. Hillary Clinton is an unusual political figure because she has been the face of mainstream politics for decades. And what research on gender and elections suggests is that at lower levels of office, when women seek office, they win at the same rates. They don't pay a penalty at the ballot box. But I am very open to the idea that there's something unique about the presidency. There's something about how Hillary Clinton is covered that is very gendered. And then the interplay of how the roles that female politicians can adopt, and the fact that Hillary Clinton has needed over time to adjust to a very, very changing political scene has, I think, led her to be viewed as untrustworthy. So is there a role for gender in attitudes for Hillary Clinton? Absolutely. But I think it's not as straightforward as people would never vote for a female candidate. I think it's more complicated. And I think it's about the ways in which our gendered perceptions interact with the role that she sought in the time she's been in politics.
Yeah, I just want to add a quick follow-up on that, which is, as far as we can tell from the exit poll, the gender gap, the difference between how men and women vote, will be exactly the same in 2016 and 2012. And so I think an important part of that question is, to the extent that there appears to be sexism at the ballot box, is probably equally driven by women's and men's sexism. And so we shouldn't just think of females' failure to potentially get votes as an issue that is only a male issue. To the extent we can tell with data like that, we don't. It's not perfect. It is probably almost as equally a female voter issue.
Right there, standing. Yes. Can you wait for the microphone, please?
As far as my understanding of the Electoral College goes, there's still a vote on December 19th where the electors actually cast their votes.
Yeah,
that's
when we'll actually elect the president.
So are they able to vote other than what their state has delegated?
So this is a really interesting question. This is the so-called faithless elector question, right? That technically there's no. In some states, I think there are laws that technically bind you, but not in every state. I think there's there are a few examples throughout American history. They're just very few and far between. Things would not go well if too many people tried to do that. right? That's not a realistic possibility.
Anyone over there? How about right there, in the baseball hat? No.
I want to ask a question about trade because I think Hillary wasn't doing that well in industrial states like Michigan, and she was facing the same challenge against Bernie Sanders in the primary. So, and that was partly because she was like one of the only frontrunners that spoke favorably of trade. So, how much of the anti-trade sentiment do you think was factored into this election, and how do you think this country and like this world will go from here?
So I think this goes to Professor Hopkins' comment about the challenges that Hillary Clinton faced having a really long career in politics. She had to take a lot of positions in the 1990s, in the 2000s, and now in the 2010s, and political environments changed. And I think part of what Donald Trump capitalized on was the fact that he could come up with a new position as of 2016 in an environment that is much less favorable to trade than it was before. How much did that affect the outcome of the election? It's hard to know, but I think as a broad, taking that and extrapolating that over lots of different issues, I think there's no doubt that Hillary Clinton lost a substantial number of votes in this election because she was saddled with positions from long ago that in the current day, if she was starting anew, would not be the position she would have put forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something to that. So political psychologists who think about attitudes, one of the things that we write about and think about is the idea of confirmation bias and like how people update their ideas. And I just wanted to underscore the point that you're making about like once people have well-formed views, it's really hard to get them to change those views. And so I think that that's something that's important to think about when thinking about like what Hillary Clinton's trajectory was.
How about you over there?
Hi. So after the election in 2012, the Republican National Committee commissioned sort of a post-mortem, I think is what they referred to it as, trying to understand why Mitt Romney lost the election and why they had lost back in 2008. And my understanding of that report is that they cited changing demographics, an increased gender gap, and especially the role of minority voters such as Latinos, who are a growing population and will continue to grow in the United States, as populations that the Republican Party had failed to reach and should work to reach in the future. Clearly that didn't happen this time, and I've heard to it referred as sort of the missing white voter theory, that certain elements of the Republican Party thought if they galvanized enough of a white base that they could actually overcome the disparities in a growing minority electorate. My question to you is, clearly, well, A, was this result a confirmation of that, and will this continue to be, is it appropriate for the Republicans to continue this strategy in the future, knowing that it's already worked once?
So it's a great question. We need to separate, as your question did, long-term trends from short-term fluctuations. Because over the long term, the GOP's postmortem was exactly right? There are something like every month there are 50,000 new Hispanic voters. And the growth in the Hispanic electorate is driven more by birth rates than by immigration, right? So even if you stopped immigration today, we are still going to continue to diversify as a country. And indeed, even if we built a wall on the Mexican border, a majority of immigrants coming to this country now are not a majority are from Asia, but more are from Asia than are from Latin America. But at the same time, election outcomes can swing, particularly as Professor Levendusky said, if most people are entrenched in their partisanship, very, very small shifts in small groups of people can lead to a President Trump or a President Clinton. So the kind of election-to-election shifts in individual voters are going to swamp the long-term secular trend towards the Democrats. And I think that speaks again to this point that persuasion, that is voters who used to back Democrats and switching to the Republicans or vice versa, in the short term, that's a much more potent source of electoral victories because you're simultaneously affecting both vote tallies. So in the long run, should we look to Asian American and Latino voters to play larger and larger roles in the Democratic coalition and in American politics? Undeniably. But does that necessarily mean that no Republican can be elected in 2020? Absolutely not.
Ms. Waddell? How about man in the blue shirt? Yeah, you. Thanks.
So it seems that a lot of the one of the biggest issues around this election was that Hillary ran like an it was kind of a very like anti-Trump campaign, whereas Trump was trying to motivate like a certain section of voters that hadn't come out before. And so I was wondering, instead of Hillary, who's kind of the face of the establishment, if someone like Bernie Sanders had won the nomination, how do you guys think that would have affected the election?
It's hard to run counterfactuals like that. One thing that I think that's important to keep in mind when judging how Bernie Sanders would have done is that he did not face a real campaign in the primary. Hillary Clinton knew she was going to win the primary pretty early on and did not bring out a lot of the ammunition that a typical campaign would have brought out against someone running against them. She didn't want to alienate the Sanders base any more than she already had. I think that Sanders would have struggled mightily in a general election against Trump. I think some of the issues with white working class voters may have been alleviated, but the amount of ammunition based on Bernie Sanders is also a very long record in Congress, combined with perceptions of how far left voters would have thought he was relative to themselves. I think Bernie would have had his own set of issues in trying to run a campaign against Trump.
Yeah, I mean, my sense of this is that Bernie Sanders actually would have lost by a larger margin. I understand that to 18 to 29-year-olds, the word socialist is not a big deal. But trust me, anyone old enough to have grown up in the Cold War, it's a big deal. Keep in mind that young people don't vote and old people do. That's just the brutal reality. And that those people are still embedded in a Cold War mindset, and that matters. And to be honest, if there is, so someone asked me, is there a Democrat that I think could have won? I mean, look, as everyone has pointed out, a small shift would have allowed Hillary Clinton, 100,000 votes, and we'd have been talking about, see, this is the confirmation. Clinton wins, 315 electoral votes. Trump is repudiated, and the narrative would have been very different. We don't get to run these counterfactuals. Because actually, I think rather than Bernie Sanders, the person who would have actually had a bigger effect is Joe Biden. But again, we don't get to run that counterfactual, so we don't know.
Anywhere over here? How about you right there?
Can you talk about social media in presidency? Because, I feel like with social media, people aren't fact-checking anymore. And in 2008, Obama outused social media than Clinton. And Trump has had a pretty big presence on the social media platforms.
Go first. I think it's a great question. And it's undeniable that our media sources are changing in ways that are very, very consequential for our politics. And there are a couple of people here, both Professor Levendusky and also Kip Lelkis, who's somewhere in the audience, who know more about this than I do. One thing I would say is that in the aftermath of any election, we have a tendency to assume that everything that the winning campaign did, was helpful to its efforts, and everything that the losing campaign did was unhelpful to its efforts. But that said, one of the challenges is that increasingly we have choice in what media we consume, and so we are able then to, particularly people who are politically active, and that's a key caveat, right? We're able to move into communities where we can be exposed to comfortable information. So how is it that so many media commentators missed the potential movement of Trump to, the potential movement of Michigan or Pennsylvania to Trump? Well, partly because a whole bunch of us are watching one another, and there's a bit of groupthink. And I think that one of the concerns about social media and about an environment where we have choice in our media is that people can start to choose the facts and expose themselves to the facts that are comfortable for their side. The thing I would emphasize, though, is that we're now talking about people who care a lot about politics. And that's going to be a pretty different group than the set of kind of marginal voters for whom politics, they're happy to vote, and they're going to pay attention. They're going to know plenty about American politics. But it's not their passion, it's not their obsession. There's a fair amount of research suggesting that many Americans have much more diverse media environments and media they're exposed to a diversity of facts and opinions that is greater than we might perceive from the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point, and I would just add that, we sort of have this sense that like every election there's something new. It's like, oh, people use Twitter, people use Facebook, and that's sort of, true, but I think we want to be cautious about over-interpreting those sort of shifts.
And keep in mind that Trump's chief of staff took away Trump's Twitter for the last 7 days of the campaign, and it is not coincidental. Not a coincidence. I think that was when you saw Trump get a lot of support back.
How about you in the light blue, right there? Yes.
Hi, this is a little off topic, but there's two questions. Why was this campaign so nasty? And is there a possibility that the election was hacked?
The hacks. Do you want to take the hack part?
No, that's okay. But it was happening.
So, why was this election so ugly? My broader perception is that you can think about political disagreements, as broadly falling into two types, right? So one set of disagreements we may have is about how to distribute available resources. And that kind of politics lends itself to compromise, to discussion, to nickel and diming, right? Should tax rates be this or that? Another very different kind of politics is symbolic politics. Is a politics where we are debating symbols that are, so this is the politics of flag burning, or the politics of, take the example of transgendered bathroom use. Undeniably, to people who are transgendered, the question of which bathrooms to use is an important question. But for the significant majority of people who are not transgendered, this is a symbolic issue, right? It's about which groups are ascendant in American society. One of my observations of this campaign, if you think back to it, is that it has been dominated by questions of symbolism, right? It's been dominated by, claims about law and order, or of a whole endless parade of symbols about trustworthiness, about group status, and such that when people during the primaries started chanting Trump at the basketball team from a diverse high school, that was a widely intelligible symbol. So I think that part of what we're seeing is that as our politics becomes more about group status, it is more symbolic, it has less give and take, it is both nastier and emptier of policy prescription.
Over here? How about you right there?
One of the things I thought was most remarkable about watching the election live was how wrong a lot of the previous predictions were. So I just wanted to get your opinion. For all the polls seemed to come in for a definitive Hillary win. I know 538 had a 77% chance Hillary at 9 p.m. on election night. Do you think a lot of the polling was due to erroneous interpretation of the polls or bad methodology, or where do you think the prediction models went wrong?
So I'm going to talk about the polls on election night itself. So we run our exit poll, the media does as a group, and so everyone sees the exact same data. 538, NBC, whoever is seeing election day data sees the exact same set of data. And if you saw these data at 5 p.m., which is the first time we were exposed to that, you saw an overwhelming Clinton victory in the data. Now, we know from the past to be a little bit skeptical of these polls. There's frequently problems with them. But that was the media narrative that everyone was working on when they're coming up with their storyboards, when they're thinking about how they're going to talk about the election. You're thinking about, well, is this election going to be called for Hillary at 11, or is it going to wait till midnight? Those are the sorts of things that are going through your mind when you first see these data, with this residual doubt that, oh, these things have been wrong before. And so I think one reason the polls were so wrong, and Professor Levendusky pointed this out to me, was that in the first wave of polling, it looked like we've never seen such a large gap between the college-educated and the non-college educated in an American election. It was like maybe a 40-point gap in support. Once we started getting data back and the exit poll gets reweighted to try to understand where it might be wrong, that gap was steadily shrinking overnight. And so I think that suggests that there was a substantial amount of lying on the part of respondents to the exit poll among the college-educated, who supported Trump but did not tell the exit poller that. That's my interpretation of why we got a lot of things wrong.
Yeah, and just to build off the point I made earlier, I think part of that is that, so I'll use the example of Indiana. So I can't tell you all of why I cared a lot about Indiana this year, but I spent a lot of time like thinking about it. And so up to election night, everyone predicted that Evan Bayh was going to win the seat, and I was so part of the disclosure is that I was one of the people monitoring Indiana at NBC, but that's part of why I cared a lot about it. But I was 100% confident that Todd Young was going to win that seat because if you apply the arbitrary Levendusky post hoc corrector to the data, if you looked, right, and this is what I'm really mad at myself is that I saw this in this one thing but completely missed it in the broader national story, was I was like, oh, Bayh is really in trouble in like the last 4 polls, and basically the aggregator is using the fact that he's winning big up until like about 10 days before the election, and it, was missing the swing. I was like, no, that's not right. The movement it's way too strong against him. And I think the same thing sort of happened, without going too much into the weeds, like one of the hard decisions in an era of partisan polarization is like how you think about how to take the people who will answer a poll and map that onto the whole electorate, because they are not the same population, right? And I think part of what we missed is like that kind of shift, right? And especially at the end, like Republicans really came home to Trump, and I think if you looked at the last couple of polls, that's sort of there in the internals. It's easy for me to say that now because I can like kind of look for it post hoc, but I suspect that that's part of the issue.
And one more thing just to add to that is if you look at people who said they made up their mind in the last week in the exit poll, that seemed to break 65-35 for Trump. And so polls are just giving you a snapshot of what you have at that point in time. We know that there's dynamics to polls that we're going to miss, and to the extent that there was a lot of late-breaking support for Trump, I think that was present and not able to be captured by the poll.
You had your hand up right there. Can you wait for thank you.
Hi. So a few of you talked about the hyper-concentration of Hillary's supporters in big cities. So the Phillies, the DCs, the Seattles. I'm curious to know, you talked a lot about how the redistribution of some of her votes to be in other places may have given her the edge to possibly win. So I'm curious as to how the Democrats should go or should think about going about the distribution of their votes in the future, knowing that Trump was able to win just based on where his votes were. That's my first question, and then my second question is, what do you think is next for Trump? I know that he's been gotten his transition plan. He's already kind of started to come up with his platform. So what can you possibly predict what he's thinking to do next?
Yeah, sure, happy to. So great questions. On the first question, which there might be more that political science can systematically say. For the second, maybe psychologists would be useful. But on the first question, the United States uses a set of political institutions which represent space, right? The U.S. Senate represents states, and the Electoral College represents states. And so I think that both parties, but this is particularly important for the Democratic Party, need to have strategies for building majorities in space. And I think then that implies that the Democrats, given the Senate cycles and given the fact that you can count on midterm electorates to turn against the party of the president currently in office, I think what that implies is the Democrats need to be a party that can at least win some of the time in Montana, which they do, but in Tennessee, in Missouri, where they can be competitive in Ohio, they can be competitive in a changing Iowa. And so the Democrats have a particular challenge, which is that their target needs to be winning more like 55% of the vote. And I think that they need to pay particular attention to the politics of those kinds of constituencies which are not swing, they already will have won a majority of the popular vote, but they need to compete in places like Tennessee from time to time, or in Georgia or in Arizona, if they're going to have any shot at building national majority coalitions, except in the wake of a tremendous Republican catastrophe?
Part of this is going to happen naturally because, as Professor Hopkins pointed out, this was an election, I think, that was characterized by symbolic politics. I think that's going to change in 2018 and 2020 because Republicans have unified control. This is going to be there's going to be a lot of policy that's going to be coming out that's going to be talked about when we come to the ballot box for the midterms and for the next presidential election. And I think the Democrats are going to be in a stronger position when they can talk about policy than when they're fighting an election that's more about symbolic politics.
Yeah, if I can just make one last comment on policy moving forward. You know, one of the sort of interesting things is that much of the Obama legacy, and I think part of the reason why he campaigned so hard for Secretary Clinton, is that his legacy is not legislative. His legacy is via unitary executive action. That all goes away the day after inauguration. All the environmental stuff, gone. Obamacare, it's going to go on, as Dan and I were talking about this on the way over, it's gone via reconciliation. So without going too far into the
Unless 3 Republican senators.
And yeah, and presuming they can hold the Republicans in the Senate, they're going to have 52 seats. They have 51 now. They're going to win the Louisiana runoff. And then as long as they can, keep 3 people from defecting, and keep in mind who are the 3 Republicans who lost, they were the most moderate ones who had the best chance of defecting. That's going to go via reconciliation. The LGBT protection rights on federal contractors are going to go. This is going to present this really interesting set of changes, and it reminds me of a point Bruce Ackerman made in a book a couple of years ago, that Democrats are really cool with executive power when Obama's in office and he's doing things that they like. I have a suspicion of Democrats are going to become a lot less accepting of executive power once President Trump is the one issuing the executive orders.
I think we're coming up right on 1 o'clock here. So, Lindsay, should we call an end to the formal part of the program? Okay, why don't we do that? And I'm guessing our panelists would be willing to sit here for another minute or two if anyone wants to ask more informal questions. Thank you very much to the School of Arts and Sciences, and thank you for coming to Knowledge by the Slice.